All right, everybody, we are just getting our live stream rolling. Instagram will come online in just a moment. We can kick it off. So it's November 6th, the day after America's Election Day, joined today by Melissa Lavasani from Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. Hi, Melissa. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Joe. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Glad we connected so early, and then we can talk about some of the upsets in psychedelia. So
Yeah.
there's a big loss in psychedelic land. Massachusetts voted no on question 4, which was going to mimic the Colorado framework quite a bit. I think there were some slight differences, but not a
Mhm.
ton. But what was going on there? Why do you think that didn't fly?
I mean, I think it's the consistent problem with the issue of psychedelics is that the foundation of knowledge within the general American population, not with people in the psychedelic world or fans of psychedelics, but the general population that doesn't really understand what psychedelics are, what the potential is, even what the history of psychedelic drugs is in the United States. I think that we have yet to speak to the general population as a movement, and that's what the problem is. So what you saw in Massachusetts was towards the end of the campaign, the polling was like really neck and neck. But what happened, I think, is people went to the polls and made the decision about it. And there was probably a bit of nervous energy. They're scared of what this can actually create. They're not quite there yet. And I know the campaign did a lot of education, but honestly, this education has to come from not a campaign that's trying to pass a ballot initiative. It has to come from a general interest to just provide that basic education to the American public. And I think we're going to continue this merry-go-round until that education is properly executed.
I think that makes sense. Um, what I learned from just one round of a little bit of meetings in DC that you helped us do, I was just shocked at how effective like a carefully
Right.
constructed narrative in person can be for folks that you think might
Mhm.
be on the opposing side of something like this. Um, can you speak to like educating people? Like what do you think it takes on a one-to-one basis?
I think that on a one-to-one basis, like how I approach educating members of Congress in different offices over the last few years, um, is start with the anecdotes, start with the stories. Oh no, my camera went.
There you go.
Start with the stories. Sorry, I didn't realize that. Start with the stories and then provide the science and keep, for the first 4 years of Psychedelic Medicine Coalition's existence on the Hill, we didn't have a real tangible ask. We're always in the hunt for research funding. Like that is, I'm very open about what I think a great first step will be for Congress. But I wasn't advocating for a bill. I wasn't pushing anything super controversial. I just wanted to provide member offices with the education that they needed. And I knew that if we can soften their hearts with stories of people finding healing with psychedelics and then pivot quickly to what research currently exists and what research needs to happen, um, that makes whatever office, no matter political party, open to a conversation about psychedelics. And I think that what's happening with these state level efforts is we're pushing too hard on a specific outcome. And that outcome is access to psychedelics. And that is a very big step for people who have very little knowledge of psychedelics. So, yes, this education can happen through these campaigns, but that gets very pricey to do over and over again. I'm not sure how much Massachusetts cost. I know it was a significant amount of money, but again, we're only educating for the purpose of seeking an outcome. There's no genuine, like, hey, I just want you to know about this. I just want to build on a relationship that we have, advance this issue in your mind, and then, you know, we'll see where we overlap with what steps we want to take next, right? It's more of a like dynamic relationship versus I'm coming to you with wanting something from you. And I think that with psychedelics, this is, it's a very big thing that we're asking people. Like, these are serious drugs that impact your brain. Can, you know, they can be extremely positive, they can be extremely negative, but this is for people like us, you know, the issue of psychedelics, we've become kind of numb to the stigma around it, when really we gotta, you know, make a concerted effort to frequently leave our echo chambers and speak to communities that haven't been spoken to without any kind of agenda, right? So I think I built trust with certain offices in Congress by not having a very specific agenda other than seeing the move, you know, providing education and seeing the movement advance over time. While I know that many people are disappointed that Massachusetts didn't happen, I still think there's so much amazing forward momentum that we're building on. Then there's really a lot of opportunity here in the future, but we really need to look at where we're investing in the psychedelic space and what kind of outcomes are really feasible.
Mm-hmm. So one thing we've chatted about is, this state by state model, being very expensive, as you said earlier. And then, you know, what actually scales here and what can move the needle. And it seems pretty clear that a lot of people are still sitting with, you know, the $1 trillion war on drugs on their lap and not being able to see past that, right? It's something that we need to educate around. And a thing that helps facilitate education is research. Can you talk a little bit about why we think research might be really the linchpin here for larger, faster change?
Well, research is knowledge, right? And it can calm your fears, or it can redirect you in a different way. And it's very clear that the problem with the cannabis movement was that there was a lot of medical and health claims being made that involved cannabis, but there was very little research that has happened on cannabis, right? Like the research on cannabis has only been a thing that's most recently been talked about in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that lack of research has really held the movement back from having real legs at the federal level. And that's created kind of this disjointed system. And I'm seeing the psychedelic movement kind of follow the same pathway that the cannabis movement has, but it's far more complicated, because now we're talking about healthcare. We're not just talking about recreational sales at all. I think it's going to be a while until we get to recreational sales of psychedelics, like a long while. So, you know, while people say all the time, I hear it all the time, you know, we don't need more research. There's research that exists, you know, until like the medical community, insurance companies, like traditional NGOs, until organizations that have been existing and work in these worlds are on board with this, like, we're going to need more research. It's not my opinion about this. It's not, you know, the psychedelic movement's opinion about this. It's the people that we're trying to convince. And frequently I would love to see the research. I hear that over and over again. I hear medical doctors that, you know, recommend medical cannabis for patients, but aren't really convinced recreational is the answer, because there's research on impacts of frequent cannabis use. You know, like we're unsure about like long-term use of some of these things. So it's it gives people a very comforting feeling knowing that certain drugs are researched a lot. And we have multiple drugs in clinical trial right now, and there's research that's gleaned off of that for sure. But that's just one piece of it. And we need to create a whole picture of, honestly, of safety around psychedelics for people to really get on board with this issue and really advocate for it themselves. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is to have the average American advocating for psychedelics, without any experience with it, get them to see, hey, this is a potential for us. And that goes so far above and beyond state level programs. Like, we've heard the governor of California, and California has had multiple attempts to try to move issues psychedelics forward. And the governor himself, who's a pretty progressive leader, say, I would love to see what the federal government does on psychedelics. And I know that even if it's a standalone bill that gets passed or a chunk of research funding that gets through appropriations, I know once something happens at the federal level, that provides cover for states in a certain way, even if it's unrelated to state level access, even if it's just, we're giving X amount of millions of dollars for federal research. Like, that makes people know, okay, so we are in the information gathering phase. Like, the federal government's involved, and we're gonna, whatever state level thing that people want to pass, like that, it provides a cleaner road for these types of issues to move forward. Right now, it's just like piecemealing it all together and getting to states wherever we think a state has potential to pass something like this, but without true engagement at the federal level that's coordinated with what's going on at the states, and really building that narrative around psychedelics being safe. It's just going to be us struggling to piece this all together.
Mm-hmm. So everybody, please, if you have questions or want us to answer anything, leave a comment or post wherever you're watching it, and I'll try to bring that in here. So yeah, I really think there is something important about being coordinated. There's been so much money spent on state level initiatives, and best I can tell, not all that much, relatively speaking, on federal efforts. California's failed, I think, at least twice. Massachusetts failed once. New York has a lot of energy going into it. I don't know that that's attached to the normal funding agencies, but I think, or groups, but I think it's interesting.
It's notoriously difficult to. Yeah, New York's so difficult to pass things. New York's, I feel like, as a state, is its own monster. I'm not sure if there's even appetite to get something passed there, but I know that there are some good people doing some good things there for sure. Yeah, it would be helpful if there was a non-West Coast type state that is willing to stick their neck out. And that's, I mean, honestly, that's why I think the DC decrim campaign in 2020 was really impactful. It's because it let people know that there's potential for this outside of your typical super progressive states. I mean, even though Washington, D.C. is super progressive on its own, we always go blue. But it definitely played a role in educating staffers that live here. I've frequently talked to Republican staffers who talk about what has happened in Washington, D.C. As like a pivoting point for them in psychedelics. So there's a lot of potential here, but yeah, I think what the energy that's been put on the state level is not equivalent to the energy that's been put on in the federal level. And I know that there has been some conversation about what has been invested in, but I think it's a bit misguided on where we actually spent money on at the federal level, right? Like, we can fund things at the federal level, but we need to fund the right things at the federal level.
Agreed. This is a little tangential, but somebody has an interesting question here. Interesting enough question. Christian Como is asking, don't most drugs already go through the FDA approval process of less research than MDMA and are actually fast tracked. I don't know about that part. How long do we talk about research without mentioning Vioxx? Like, I think we're talking about two different things here, Christian. We're talking about like a drug development pathway versus federally allocated funds for research. What we saw with MDMA was kind of like partisan corporate research, not necessarily like absolutely unaffiliated cold university research. Do you have a talk track around this, Melissa, for Christian at all?
Yeah, I mean, I hear this point in various versions a lot. And you're exactly right. Like, it's one thing for a corporation that's trying to take a drug through clinical trial, and the research they need to satisfy the FDA's requirements is slightly different than the research and data that is needed to convince the American people that, this is okay. MDMA at some point will get approved, I'm presuming. That doesn't mean people will be willing to take it. They could still, go through every other available drug for PTSD before they even get to MDMA. And also, it's one thing to have research on a drug that's going through an FDA process, but we're talking about drugs that are heavily weighted in stigma. In the American public's mind, MDMA is a club drug. It's defined that way. So it's almost like you got to do all this extra work to undo the stigma as well as inform the public. It plays kind of like a twofold role in that, like, yes, we need to fulfill the regulatory requirements, but we also need to properly educate, and we also need to research issues around the use of that. We can't assume that just because data looks good for psychedelics in clinical trial, that means like it's going to be green light all the way around. It's going to be a process where we're undoing all of the preconceived notions that people have about these drugs, and taking a club drug into a therapy is just going to require some time. Did we lose Joe?
I'm back.
All right.
Sorry about that. But I thought most of it, like, around turning public opinion about such a strongly stigmatized drug back into a favorable position is really hard. But very worth doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to save lives, so we should be doing everything in our power to make sure this comes to the finish line, because this can be extremely powerful for our society, and the potential is not lost, but it's just going to take some time to really redefine psychedelics for the American people.
Right. We did a really good job demonizing these things. Spent a lot of money and a lot of time making them really dangerous. And it's tragic because so many people could have been helped. Like, how many people with end of life anxiety or postpartum depression or many of these indications we know can be helped by psychedelics. Like, these people suffered far longer than they should have had to. And it's because of this war on drugs that was rolled out against this movement in part. And coming back from that, it's going to be hard and very important, though. We can't just stop. If we want to keep helping people, we can't just stop. Are you ready for another question?
Yeah, I mean, all the best things in life are hard. I'm ready for whatever questions we've got.
So from LinkedIn, this is from Lloyd. Do you feel, in regard to vets, that mushrooms have a pathway to medical availability and or end of life patients? Psilocybin makes a case for health in these cases. I think I know what you're going to say, but let's have it.
Yeah, I mean, the most likely place for vets to access this is going to be through the VA, through VA sanctioned research, VA provided care. There is a lot of interest at the VA level to start kind of starting up programs. We've seen with last week the leadership in the VA is saying to Lycos, like, hey, we can help you with your whatever studies you need to fulfill for the FDA. Like, that's a great sign. We've heard Health and Human Services Administration say they want the VA to move. We've seen Congress show interest in VA administering these medications. Like, having veterans leave the country for treatment is a terrible situation for the VA. And I think what has happened now is a perfect storm has been created so that the VA feels the pressure, Congress feels the pressure to move something. HHS definitely wants to move something. And I think that is what the next move is going to be, is real action, whether directed from Congress or, in something internally organizing at the VA. Like, it's clear that that's already been happening. But something will happen soon with the VA so they can bring those veterans back into their healthcare system. And, while fulfilling research needs, while, figuring out issues of, how do you integrate therapy into psychedelic assisted treatment. I think that was a struggle for the FDA to kind of wrap their head around. I think the VA is going to play a very big role in what psychedelic assisted care looks like for everybody, but first for their population of patients, which is obviously veterans. But so something happening at the VA for veterans, which is limiting access, right, to psychedelics at the federal level, but that is a critical first step. And how a lot of drugs kind of get commercialized is things start at the VA, and it's like the test tube for, figuring out what works, what doesn't work for the administration of a certain drug. And then it gets scaled up into a larger healthcare system. I mean, the VA is a very large healthcare system in itself, but it gets scaled up on a healthcare wide scale after things get tested like this at the VA.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah, I love the idea of it scaling there. And I think there was that headline about potentially the VA funding some of the Lycos phase 3, which is an interesting statement. I think that's kind of far out, but at least somebody said it. So,
I mean, I think it's possible. I think it's possible. I think that VA is realizing they're feeling the pressure because so many veterans are curious about this, because so many have very little relief from traditional treatments for PTSD, right? So I think it's totally possible the VA funds this, at least partially. And honestly, I wish that Lycos went to the VA earlier, like during clinical trial, and said, hey, can we get some participation on this? And, maybe that was a lesson learned for the Lycos leadership, is why was, there are creative ways to accomplish our goals that don't necessarily need to all be funded by one company. Like, let's utilize the federal government for what they're good for. Tons of pharmaceutical companies use federal funds to get their drugs approved. And why is the psychedelic space not doing the same? Makes no sense to me.
Right. And, given that 2 of these compounds got granted breakthrough status by the FDA, indicates that these drugs are very likely exceptional and need to get put through, with some speed. Danny McCracken on my Facebook is asking about any kind of centralized hub where, as we were talking about, like these stories paired with the data. Is there anything you like to point folks to as a resource?
To share stories?
So say you're going to try to
Or
spin somebody up, like we said earlier, like you want to kind of have the nice story and then back it up by like, here's the research and here's what we need to research more. Similar to what you were saying earlier in that way.
Yeah. So, I mean, a resource that obviously, like podcasts, obviously your podcast is a great place to point people to, because you have such an interesting, you put a lot of interesting guests with different perspectives. I think that that podcast format is something that people feel really comfortable with now, and it can within an hour, hour and a half, 30 minutes provide you context, information, and like, you know, motivation to move forward with whatever you're trying to get information on. You know, I think the question was asking that, right? Like, how do you, when you have somebody in front of you that you want to educate with psychedelics, like what resources you point to? Obviously, there's like How to Change Your Mind it was a very effective documentary in kind of relaying the message of psychedelics that seemed very a safe place to send people. Honestly, sometimes I just go to NIH's website and like pull up research papers that you know, are peer reviewed and provide that as companion to a podcast. I feel like is really effective. It kind of depends on who you're talking to and what will be really convincing to them, whether, you know, your audience member is a veteran, like that they might want to hear a veteran story. If your target audience is a mother, like that, you know, there's plenty of stories of mothers, including myself, where who have taken psychedelics and, you know, are on their healing pathway. So it would be great if we had one centralized hub for all the stories that people have, but I also think that what could be way more effective is just like an advocacy campaign, right? Like, I think that's what really needs to happen next, is an advocacy campaign that is really based on human stories and seeking more information from the scientific community and advocating for research and advancement of this at the federal level. That advocacy campaign can be a powerful place to gather these kind of stories that are all over the psychedelic space that we hear about all the time, and to really catalyze these stories to affect change. So like, to anyone that's really looking for a place, I think, to go, I think Psychedelics Today is a wonderful place to start. And, you know, all kinds of other podcasts. I mean, you might have somebody that you know that you're trying to convince of this and you want to send to the Joe Rogan podcast. You know, I think Joe Rogan dives, this is one of the topics he does a pretty decent job at, is to dive into the issue of psychedelics. He's obviously personally really curious about it. So it just kind of depends on who you're talking to and what you think would be effective for them to hear.
Agreed. Yeah. Rogan has done about as much as anybody for advocacy around psychedelics, which is, you know, it's something that's sometimes a little hard to swallow, but it's true. And, you know, some of his content's really great, like with Rick or Rick Strassman. Some of those episodes are really helpful. And even some of the veteran discussions really helpful, because he has the ear of a lot of veterans, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, he's got a huge platform. I wish Kamala did the podcast. I really think that like she could have covered a lot of ground in that podcast if she would have just agreed to do the 3-hour format, whatever hour, in Austin with Joe. I think that like it's a big misstep for her campaign, was not doing it. But yeah, like it's all kind of, there's art to storytelling that that really exists, and it's a lot of it depends on who your audience is, and it's not going to be it's not going to be the same discussion every single time. It has the core of the discussion is going to be the same, but it's kind of tailor-made for who you're talking to. That's why I think that, we've seen a lot of veteran stories on in the federal advocacy space, because I think that there is this preconceived notion that it's the Republicans that are going to hold this up. So we know the Republicans are really passionate about veteran advocacy. But honestly, I think to really scale up this issue, it needs to be the human story, not only the veteran story. It needs to be people from all walks of life describing, what they're going through, what they try to navigate in the healthcare system, how the healthcare system failed them, how their issues, their mental health issues, or whatever issues they're dealing with, chronic pain, how it impacts their life, and like what their potential could be. And I think that that's really providing a much bigger picture is kind of critical to getting buy-in on this. And I think the veteran piece is one piece of it, and that's really a policy outcome that can come out of this. Is if we do this right, we push this hard enough, we can get some reforms that impact the VA and provide care so that others can get care. But it's truly, we are at this moment now where we've had a captured audience on psychedelics, and I hope we don't lose it, right? That we have this window of opportunity to get this issue through. There's a lot of momentum, but if the proper efforts aren't funded, or we keep going down this state level effort that keeps failing, like, we're gonna kind of lose the interest of people on this issue, and it's going to be packaged into this is clearly too fringe for the American people right now, and there's no appetite for this. But if we can kind of get our crap together and come up with some real policy asks that are feasible to accomplish in our current environment, then I think this whole movement can really take off. But it's going to take a very concerted advocacy effort with the proper amount of funding and support from the movement and support from outside, honestly.
Right. So, yeah, I think in terms of resources, Paul How to Change Your Mind on Netflix is a fine introduction for folks. It doesn't get it perfect. Nothing really ever does. But it's definitely very helpful and very convincing. And then, groups like Heroic Hearts have been doing some really great veteran-specific advocacy. Moms on Mushrooms. There's a number of women-specific psychedelic advocacy groups, education groups, which I really appreciate, because I think moms and veterans are the two easiest talk tracks.
Yeah.
But to your point, like getting kind of people back to their lives, that's, if we total all the people sidelined from their lives and being good citizens and contributors to the country by things like chronic pain, major depression disorder, anxiety, all sorts of things that could theoretically be treated by psychedelics or have been at least anecdotally shown to, like, that's a huge portion of the American public that we can get back to working on really important things like all of the most important political issues of the day, climate change included, right? So how do we get these people back? I don't think conventional psychiatry is going to really help. I think we've hit a drug development kind of limit in psychiatry. Maybe that's not the right phrasing, but a real bottleneck at least. And then even for things like chronic pain, we don't really have new great drugs. We're still mostly in the opioid frame, which is fine. I love opioids. I use them for every time I have surgery, but it's definitely problematic. So I just think, like, if we look at the total opportunity, it's huge. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Opioids, I know, are just such a heavy topic, but they play their role. Like every other drug plays their role. And it's we have to look at the issue of psychedelics from somebody, not from our perspective, but from somebody who doesn't have any experience whatsoever with this. And I think things like chronic pain and depression are really held up because there's a real lack of understanding of what these things are. I think unless you suffer from chronic pain, you really don't have a concept for what it's like to live with it. Unless you have suffered from depression or know somebody, even if you've known somebody that suffered from depression, you might not understand it. I mean, I before my own postpartum, I had a few friends that had suffered from really serious depression to the point that they were on medication, they were in intensive talk therapy. They were willing to do whatever they needed to do to get better, and they were not. I didn't understand depression until I went through it. So there's a real ignorance around what living with some of these conditions are. Once I had gone through my experience, I was like, holy shit, this is so different than what I thought it was. And, we have to kind of educate on that of a person who has like no context for any of this, which is very difficult to do, but it's not impossible.
And I forgot to mention headaches, which I always kind of consider as part of chronic pain. But our friends at Cluster Busters have been at this fight for a long time. And this speaks to question 4 a little bit, and perhaps even to Colorado and Oregon, where those populations who have been patient populations who've been advocating for policy change for the longest time, cluster headache people, they weren't really included in how these things would have been played out, right? It makes no sense to have to pay a bunch of money to go into a regulated clinic for their kind of condition. That said, thankfully, there was some decriminalization, but how many people are really punished for this? Not too many, but too much for sure. So go ahead.
I think that organizations like Cluster Buster were left out of the conversation in Massachusetts, probably because they would like to see this integrated with healthcare, right? Like this is, regulated adult use is very different than going to a doctor for a chronic condition and getting a treatment plan. That's the kind of the essential piece to all this is people approach psychedelics from a lack of healthcare, a healthcare need that they're not getting from traditional healthcare. And while some people have the means to pay the thousands of dollars for a state regulated program and they'll go do that, that is an extreme privileged place to be sitting in. The majority of Americans don't have that privilege. So how do we provide safe, affordable access is we do it through our healthcare system.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much. I've learned so much working with them over the past bit of time here, and they don't even get taught how to use oxygen tanks properly. Never mind reasonable consults on mushroom use. So a long way to go. So folks, just a reminder, you can ask questions, put some stuff out there wherever you're watching this, and I'll try to bring them in if they're a good fit for us here. And we're talking about the recent loss in Massachusetts on question 4. We also want to pivot at a certain point, probably soon, to what's going to happen. What do we think might happen? Let's actually jump there now, and we can jump back to questions in a little bit. So it looks as though former President Trump will be taking office in a little bit of time here, and RFK is I forget the terminology. There's so much funny phrasing. He's going to be in charge of all that health stuff, and I think that's interesting because he has shown sympathy for understanding the research around psychedelics. I know some people who have actually been chatting with RFK for a long time about psychedelics. So I think he's sympathetic and could be, putting in some sort of decisions to really fund this stuff. But what's your read on, what can we kind of predict maybe? I know prediction's always hard.
I mean, you can't predict anything in our country. I think even the polls were indication of that for last night. But what I can tell with RFK is that I think he wants to do good, especially by the issue of psychedelics. It's obviously a place that he's extremely curious about. I know that there's been a lot of chatter about. I considered him to be appointed as like a healthcare czar of some sort, but you know, nothing moves quickly in federal government. Even when you have like a Trump presidency, it's going to take some real time to implement what he wants to implement. I'm not quite sure. Like, I know he wanted to say he wanted to dismantle agencies and stuff. That again, like that's a dramatic statement. It's going to take some time, and it's not completely, their decision to dismantle an entire agency like the FDA. What I do think will happen is that, slowly our government, if RFK is appointed into this position, which I think is a heavily weighted kind of stance, because I know he's on the right side of things with psychedelics and has maybe some more controversial viewpoints on other things. I think that the bright light out of all this is that we could potentially create a softer, friendlier landing place for psychedelics within the federal government. And that's what I've always said. I think that people were initially really nervous about a Trump presidency in regards to psychedelics, because I think there is this thing that's embedded in our brains that Republicans are the hardest nut to crack with psychedelics, which is not true at all. What we found over the last 4 years. And I think this Republican president especially is he's out there. I think he likes those big, crazy ideas. I mean, he likes the RFKs who say things like, we need to dismantle healthcare and rebuild it again. It's because it's a big statement to take. And clearly there are issues with our healthcare system that need to be fixed. So I think for those of you that are happy about the Trump presidency, congrats, you guys won. For those of you who are not happy about it, and are into psychedelic advocacy, the hope here is that we create a government that's open to these big ideas and will support seeing it through. So for me as a voter, I have my opinion, but me as a psychedelic advocate, I saw hope in both pathways, and I think that whatever momentum that we had going into this election will just continue to grow post this election.
That's interesting. Yeah. Do you have any opinions on this whole idea of getting insurance reimbursement for things like ketamine assisted psychotherapy? Do you think that's something that could shift in the near term? I'm thinking of projects like Enthea, for instance, and maybe that could scale to other insurers.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be helpful if, ketamine is, that's a tough one, because obviously ketamine has made so many headlines recently, and not great headlines. But I think research plays a very big role in insurance coverage. So I think that, and I'm pretty sure there's some research happening with ketamine that's been going on, that's starting to grow. I think that is what is going to convince the insurance companies to cover this. I think that they need to see an outcome that makes the financial argument for covering ketamine. I think that, unfortunately, it might have to boil down to that, is we need to talk about on a big scale how these treatments save money in the long run, because that is ultimately our healthcare system is really bound by how we're structured and who the power players are. It's insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. And I think that getting research around lost productivity, definitely some safety research with ketamine is very much needed to kind of undo what's gone on the last couple of years with ketamine and like the bad PR that it's gotten. And
Are people asking you about it in DC from a scary perspective?
about
Like, are
ketamine?
people in DC actually concerned about like the safety around ketamine from what you've heard?
I think yes, it is, because it's how the ketamine is administered, right? I think in a lot of people's minds, it's maybe too accessible, right? There needs to be some kind of boundaries around it. I think the smartest thing to do with ketamine is to be really creative about how it's administered. Like, how can we create treatment protocols that involve ketamine, but maybe it's not the mid to long-term solution for people. Maybe it is the thing that is the immediate intervention, and it's really good at that immediate intervention, right? You have somebody that is going through crisis and can't get out of the loop and is in a terrible place. Ketamine is a great drug for situations like that, but it seems to have these properties where it can be addictive for certain people. And maybe people with addiction don't really even, as their issue, don't even really go down the ketamine pathway. And there may be other things. It's just, I think that ketamine's popularity has picked up so much because it is one of the few things that does show efficacy in the immediate. I know a lot of people who have tried ketamine treatment just personally, anecdotally, and they say, yes, it's helped me tremendously. But if I don't get my infusions, my bi-monthly infusions, whatever it is, I feel my mental health kind of slip back. So we need something that kind of breaks this dependency we have on pharmaceuticals, right? Like, I know tons of people that say that about ketamine. I know tons of people that say that about antidepressants. Like, yeah, my antidepressant did help me, but I'm now 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road. I don't want to be on it anymore. So how do we get creative with treatments that don't require us to be on a lifetime with a drug? And I know that goes against a lot of the models for pharmaceutical companies. But at the end of the day, this is going to be profitable if it's done the right way and it's resourced the right way. This is going to be profitable for pharmaceutical companies. So there is interest in it. We've seen some Johnson & Johnson, AbbVie, like major pharmaceutical companies show interest in psychedelics. So it's just kind of like going through the steps that other drugs have gone through in the past, and then some, to kind of undo the stigma. But I think that ketamine is there because it's legal and it's accessible for a lot of people. And we just need to kind of think thoroughly and really long-term about what mental health options can be. And I think well-done research can inform that.
Agreed. Yeah. So the ketamine stuff is interesting in that I think you and I are probably in a similar camp on this. It's not the miracle drug a lot of folks think it is, but for the right person with the right situation, it can be. It can actually be truly life-saving. It can be really cheap too. It's about $7 a gram. Doctor cost, but that's not really what patients see. They usually see quite the bill. And
Yes.
I think, even with Spravato, we see like really great results. That's filtered ketamine produced by Janssen folks, and great results in cutting back on major depression disorder, suicidality, things like that. And we don't have that same kind of data yet around mushrooms or psilocybin, psilocin, LSD, etc. Like, this is all stuff that we need to research robustly before we can really speak to it skillfully in the same way as we can with ketamine. And I think it's a great short-term intervention. Paired with therapy, it can be great with long-term intervention, right? Like, the people that get infusions typically don't get the right kinds of therapy soon enough, maybe. But it doesn't mean they're not getting helped, right? But a point you
No.
made, Melissa, was really good around people don't necessarily want to be on pills the rest of their lives. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
when I go and see my doctor, they're very often very happy to put me on a drug for the rest of my life without
Mm-hmm.
really talking to me at length about it. They're just like, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
you're just going to be on this forever." And I think like this is something that like RFK and this could actually be a pretty interesting point of sympathy with a lot of Republican audiences, because I think a lot of them don't also want to be on drugs the rest of their lives if they don't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think that liberals definitely want to be. I think they're just maybe more okay with it, perhaps. um,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, it's an interesting thought. I don't know if that's a little too far out, but this is a sense I get of like being very anti-pharma, which is kind of a big RFK thing.
I mean, I think the attitude towards pharma has significantly shifted in the last 10 years for sure.
Hmm.
I don't think people really realized how our healthcare system was structured for a very long time, right? I think that there's been a lot that's been unveiled about how things work in our American system, and that doesn't always benefit the American people. I think that's why RFK really resonated with so many people in general this election cycle, is because
Hmm.
we're in this like post-COVID world, um, which uprooted this like underlying mental health crisis that we were all quietly going through. Now it's all out there. People tried to navigate their healthcare during COVID. They tried to navigate mental health care and were left extremely unsatisfied. And we're here in 2020, at the end of 2024, going into 2025, post the 2020 lockdown. And there's still like no real movement from the federal government on mental health. There's no like mental health moonshot. There's no, there something hasn't happened, and something must happen soon for this. Because I think Americans, quite honestly, in general, I don't think this is a Republican or conservative liberal thing. I think Americans in general are just like, I want something better for themselves, right? Like, that's all anybody wants in this country, is just to like create a life for themselves that was better than what they had as a kid, or create a better life for their children than what they had. Um, it's like the American dream seems very far off for a lot of people, and we see the swinging in the polls to kind of indicate that, and people don't want the status quo anymore. They want the creative thinkers that are going to address their problems, and it's it's uh it's a dissatisfaction that I think is super bipartisan, that we can change the system to benefit us. We just need to create the right arguments for this, right? Like,
Hmm.
whatever, we need to be like the loudest voice in the halls of Congress, not necessarily the pharmaceutical companies. And that's like this, if when you break it down, like my very practical brain is like, but the pharmaceutical companies have all this money and power that they've spent years, decades and decades establishing with our government. But honestly, America is built on its citizens. Like, we are the ones driving GDP. Like, we are doing that, and we need to kind of harness that power to create change, to create a system that more benefits us. Um, and I think that we're going to get there. It's going to be a really long process. I think now more than ever, people want instant gratification. I think that's why these state ballot efforts are so popular, is because it turns something around relatively quickly. In like a year's time, you're creating access to psychedelics. But is it the right thing? That's up for debate. I wouldn't say that, a lot of people, I mean, Oregon is not super popular. I mean, I know the wait list is really long for the program, but jury's still out on if is this the right pathway for people who have a
Hmm.
healthcare need, to just like pay out of pocket. And insurance is not going to cover an Oregon model. Insurance is not going to cover Colorado model. Unless somebody comes up with a creative way to make that happen, that's literally going to be groundbreaking. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have pathways that exist that we can pursue. It's just we have to follow through with it and be patient and understand that there's going to be compromises along the way, and that's okay as long as you're moving forward and continuously refining your arguments and refining your ask to be more palatable to your opposition. I think that progress is going to happen. It's just we're going to have to get rid of our impatience to positive results, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we're in it for the long haul for psychedelics. Like we're in a situation where it might be a while until we have insurance covering LSD assisted treatments, right? Like psilocybin assisted treatments. But like I'm doing this for future. I'm doing this for my children. So if my children ever fall on a mental health crisis in their lives, that there are protocols and evidence-backed solutions that are available to them to their healthcare, and it just involves a copay. That's the ultimate goal. And we see how other drugs achieve this. So we gotta follow through, and we gotta just see if we can get this to happen for psychedelics. And I think we can, because it's such a promising treatment.
Thanks for that. Somebody on LinkedIn, Deborah Thorne, mentioned, I'll put her name up here, mentioned here in New Mexico, we're now sitting at the table at the Department of Health, policymakers for the state and legislators to prepare a bill for 2025. We are leaning in to observe and learn from other states to avoid pitfalls. Hopefully our bill makes it to the governor's desk for signing. Like, well, I'm happy to hear that, Deborah. Like, let's talk. Like, there was definitely a lot of
Yeah.
issues with the Massachusetts, Colorado, and Oregon campaigns. I don't know, anything you want to say about that kind of thing, Melissa?
Yeah, I would say look at Texas. Texas is a great state to look at for psychedelics. I think that their approach is to kind of meet the legislatures where they are, and um, and it sounds like through conversations that I had that the next legislative session is going to be very big. There's multiple things in the pipeline. But what Texas has done, what the advocates in Texas have done, is really been patient and, tried to create that like regular cadence of meetings with legislators and their staffers, and really make sure the asks have been reasonable thus far. The research bill that passed there a couple of years ago wasn't a lot of money at all. But what we have seen happen is they got that passed thanks to many advocates and Rick Perry getting involved in the 11th hour and sealing the deal for them. Is they built on that, and slowly over time, they're getting the the legislature to buy into psychedelics in a real genuine way. This isn't being forced down their throats. It's about relationship building. And if we see this as a relationship building activity, that's when you get to the point where you have a foundation with people that are in power that can make change happen. And it's coming from genuine interest from them, not necessarily advocates pushing an issue. When you have advocates pushing so hard on an issue and the interest is not genuine within the halls of Congress or within the state legislature, like it's going to be forced. It's going to be, people are going to try and undo what's being done. I always say that, like, Oregon passed with a few percentage, like maybe 4 or 5 percentage points. Colorado passed with an even slimmer margin. That's, in my mind, that's kind of a failure to me. Is you have half of the state opposing something, and half of the state in favor of something. Are you back?
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
No, it's okay. You have half of the state opposing something, half of the state in favor of something. We saw what that did to Oregon, right? It kind of undid the intention of Measure 109. And our goal should be to get the majority of people seeing the light of day and seeing this as having a promise for their state. So, Deborah, reach out if you want to chat. I can connect you with the people in Texas. I think they're really doing things the right way and being patient and listening to what the legislators are wanting to do and are able to do. And they understand that it's a long game that we're playing. It's not, the short-term wins might feel good in the interim, but really we should all be focusing on the long term and what this means for us in the long term and what kind of system we're creating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm seeing an interesting comment here from Instagram. RFK is big on decriminalization. I heard the comment once or twice. I don't know how true that is. And getting more addiction retreat centers. I could potentially believe that. I've heard rumor that he used psychedelics to help heal from some addiction issues. Then they say the downside is that Vance is quite opposed, so that might be a big mountain for RFK to climb. But the people are active. I think that's interesting. I think it goes back to like, how do we humanize these stories, and then share, hey, this is probably what we need to do. If we look at the failure rate of addiction clinics, domestic kind of residential addiction clinics, it's really bad. And these are like really approved bad centers like that. We can do a lot better, and a lot less money can get wasted. Perhaps these addiction treatment centers actually need to like modify their model and bring these things on board in some way. I don't necessarily want to see them go. Some people really like that they're there. But yeah, this is an interesting conversation, and it's bipartisan, right? Like, addiction doesn't really see your political affiliation.
It's I think the smartest thing for us to do is to work off of what exists currently in the healthcare infrastructure. And while addiction treatment centers don't have really great success rates, I wouldn't even say they were good. They're pretty terrible. The incentive to actually cure people is not quite there. And also, like, it's really hard to treat addiction. I think that there is not like one theory that is the best theory on this. Like, and this is like one of the promising areas with psychedelics, is that like this could be the one thing for addiction that is really effective. And how do we get this out there? Again, like, it has to be in healthcare. This is a healthcare issue. It's a mental health issue. It's a physical health issue. I appreciate RFK's excitement about this, but yeah, like, it's not going to be as easy as just like plug and play. You still have the FDA process you have to go through. I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback if federal decriminalization comes up. Like, that's not going to be very popular at all. And at the end of the day, like, we do have a vice president that's been very outspoken on this issue. And does that go in opposition with what RFK wants to happen? So they're going to have to figure out as an administration who's playing what role and what's actually feasible. And I'm just hoping that they hire the right people that know how to get things done. I think with the first Trump administration, there was a lot of interest within the Republican Party to dive right into the Trump presidency and put some buffers on it, right? I'm who's left out of that? We've seen a lot of former Trump appointees jump to campaign against him, and then we also saw with the first Trump presidency a flight of institutional knowledge of people that have been working for government, career staff, people that knew how to get things done in government, a lot of them left with the first Trump presidency. And I feel like I hope that staffers understand that, they're really critical. And while working for a Trump presidency wasn't their preference, I hope that the people that get hired into those types of positions and the people that get appointed are the right people that know how to get things done. Otherwise, it's just going to be a political talking point for them. Because it's notoriously hard to get things done in the federal government. It is difficult. It takes a lot of money, and it takes the right relationships, and it takes knowing how to navigate very complicated systems. And it's going to be even harder to navigate those complicated systems if you don't have the experts in the right position. So we'll see this kind of interaction between what RFK's wants and desires are and what can actually be accomplished.
Yeah, thanks for that. Final few things. A lot of people are asking here how to get involved with PMC or support PMC. How do you like to talk about that?
Yeah, please go to our website, reach out. My email is melissa@psychedelicmedicinecoalition.org. I'm actually a pretty accessible person. If you'd like to get involved, we always welcome people to join in on the movement. I think that this year has been really an interesting year for psychedelics. It felt like everything was moving at lightning speed and at pause at the same time. So we've spent this year kind of recalibrating ourselves to what potential next Congress is going to be, next presidency is going to look like. And we're really trying to forge a new pathway forward for psychedelics with the federal government. So please reach out to me, sign up at our website, psychedelicmedicinecoalition.org. Hopefully we'll have some big things to announce in the new year. Really, really excited about what's coming for this space in Washington, D.C. I think this is the power move right now, and I need everyone's help, and we can accomplish the thing that we need to accomplish. We just need the right support. And for those of you that woke up this morning not necessarily excited about this outcome, don't lose hope. Our country is not going to implode. It might feel like it. Our kingdom is it is what it is. The United States is just another country on this planet that exists, and we might not be the great beacon of hope for the world's population anymore, but I think that a presidential term is 4 years. This is a second term for Trump. I'm hoping that his speech that he gave at 2:30 in the morning that I woke up and saw, I hope that he really means that he wants to heal the country and bring people together. We'll see what happens. Nothing is shocking to me anymore with American politics, but what I am happy about is that the issue of psychedelics is alive and well in the federal government, and there's a lot of interest in Congress. There's a lot of interest in the VA. There's a lot of interest within Health and Human Services to do this issue the right way. And we're in the mix of all these conversations. So if you want to get involved, just reach out.
Yeah, and if funders in the psychedelic space, people who like to donate and do political work, let's have a conversation with Melissa and see if you can't help us move the ball forward with PMC. I think it's one of the most important organizations doing lobbying work, and very, very important. So Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today. What's the website where people can find you?
Psychedelicmedicinecoalition.org. And I'm on all social media platforms as well, on LinkedIn as well. So happy to have a conversation with anyone that is interested in politics, anyone that wants to fund politics. Like this is the game we have to play, and you need the organization, the people with knowledge of how DC works, like from inside the sausage factory. And that's kind of the team of people that I've put together, is not necessarily those in the psychedelic space, but those outside the space in the political policy world that know how to make things move and make things change, that are interested in psychedelics. So this is a very critical step for all of us, and hopefully we can connect some dots for the organization through funders, through whatever kind of resources you might have. But yeah, reach out.
Right on. Thank you, Melissa. Green Skeptics asking what does Massachusetts do next? I'm going to handle that in a separate live stream and probably in my email on Friday that I'll send out. So get on our email list and we can talk more. Melissa, thanks so much. Let's hang out and chat backstage for a minute. But thank you. Really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Joe.